And next we have our second panel, titled Rebuilt Afghanistan. And our co-moderators are Najim Azadzoy and Darren Stocker. They will introduce the panel, and we will have the panel going until 11:50 a.m. Thank you.
Good morning. I'm honored to moderate this panel of highly experienced and knowledgeable individuals who have years of experience in understanding of the situation in Afghanistan. Before I introduce the panelists, I would like to thank the presentation by Sigar. I, as an Afghan-born architect, that I spent my last 13, 14 years mainly working in Afghanistan on a number of significant projects, from designing and building military bases for the Afghan National Army, to schools, universities, other public facilities. Thank you very much. I was really encouraged and by the words that I heard from Sigar, that the future for Afghanistan is bright and is going to be much more carefully planned for the next step to going forward. In this part, we have Darren Stocker, who's a professor at Cape Cod University, has years of experience in education and research. Next, we have Ahmad-Shah Durani-Khan. He's an Afghan-born architect. He's written books on peace and stability related to a subject of Afghanistan or issues in Afghanistan. We have Mr. James Bullion, if I hope I can pronounce correctly, former director of U.S. Department of Defense Task Force for Business and Stability Operations. We have Paul Fishtein and his assistant Zabiullah Zamani, who is not sitting here. Paul is an independent researcher at Taft University. As far as I know, Paul has spent much of his time working in Afghanistan, probably long before the Russian invasion. He was involved there. And last, we have Theodore Sawruk. Mr. Sawruk is also an architect, an associate professor at the University of Hartford. I'm delighted to have them here, and we will start with Mr. Stocker, Darren, to present his paper. I would like to have, the time limit, 8 minutes or 10 minutes for each. And then at the end, we have 30 minutes of answer and questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for...
Could we have the associate to help us with the slide operation?
Does this work? Thank you very much for allowing me to take this opportunity to be here. Also thank the provost and the two deans who did the introduction, and of course Dr. Latana for putting this together. It really is a unique opportunity for all of us to get together, and I consider it a privilege to be able to look at things through my lens and try and give you the perspective that someone in academics has with my background. So I am a professor of criminal justice and criminology at Cape Cod. I'm also an affiliate faculty member at St. Joseph's University, where several years ago we designed virtual education modules to reflect really responding to disasters. I was able to put together two particular courses, Risk Assessment Management and the Sociology of Disasters, which I'm very fond of. One of the reoccurring themes that I heard earlier this morning from the previous panel consisted of things along the lines of security, economics, culture, sustainability, and they really touched on some issues that really need to be really drilled down to and widely discussed in order to address the issue. I'll paint a picture and then I'll give you a little synopsis here. The history of the region in more recent times in Afghanistan really provides a sketch of a country that's recovering from a series of wars. It faces or possesses perpetual political and social unrest. It battles extreme poverty. It faces really an uncertain future, but it's not an impossible future. And I think that's the lens in which we should see places like Afghanistan and other nations that are facing very similar concerns. The topography of the nation provides really a lot of challenge as far as sustainable land that's unfavorable for establishing communities. It provides very few natural resources that are valuable for human existence. The arid region in itself, and you'll hear my colleagues talk about this, has witnessed things like deforestation, land erosion, environmental contaminants from the wars. So any contemporary recovery and subsequent reconstruction is really looking at making sure that things are in place in order to sustain its population. Over the last several years, roughly 4.5 Afghans have left the country, some to Iran, some to Pakistan. And quite honestly, Afghanistan needs those people back. It really is, if you look at a country, you have to look at its population, and you have to believe that it's the foundation of rebuilding falls on the shoulders of its population. In order to recover and improve a lifetime of man-made disasters, which this country has faced, you have to look at it in phases. And one of the questions, God bless you, sir, one of the questions I heard earlier from the group was, how long is this going to take? There is no answer, but it's generational. It's not a quick fix. It's something where the generation and the next generation and the next generation really has to believe in its people and its foundation and its culture and its heritage and the valuable things that Afghanistan provides. The resolution and rebuilding process can take decades, and I will tell you that to believe that it's going to take any time shorter would probably be careless as well as premature. However, specific elements in that rebuilding process has to look at specific levels, and those are the levels of underdevelopment as far as political underdevelopment, economic underdevelopment, as well as the cultural variables that reflect that particular nation. So how do we do this? Well, we look at mitigation, and mitigation is nothing more than a process of looking at the consequences and lessening those consequences. It really is going to take rebuilding the infrastructure. And that's not just the hard infrastructure, but the cultural infrastructure as well. So I'm going to break this down, and I'm going to do it rather quickly, but we have to look at political underdevelopment. That really is a daunting task in trying to, I think, to try and define what political underdevelopment is, and you can get that from a variety of perspectives. I look at things from a functional perspective. I look at bees in a bee colony, I look at ants in an ant colony and say, what is the job that each of those has? Well, we can do that with populations as well. In order for a good political, sustainable political field, or I'm trying to think of the right word, but anyway, politics to really, I'm lost for words, right? Politics to work, you have to look at honest and competitive elections. You have to make sure that people have the ability to participate in those elections and that there's true, honest political participation. You also need a free mass media, and you need an open mass media. And lastly, the government has to be respectful of human rights. And we could look at Afghanistan and the human rights that have existed or not existed in Afghanistan, but we could look at those same issues around the world. And we know that we have to address those issues, and we know that we have to fix those issues. It is good that in 2004, Afghanistan adopted a new constitution, and it looked for considerable advancements when it comes to human rights and the rights of women, constitutional rights for women, including political rights, and also the availability of health care. Political underdevelopment is a major cause of poverty, especially those who are in the Middle East and those who are in sub-Saharan Africa. Afghanistan currently ranks as one of the poorest countries in the world and does face an uncertain future. However, I'll reiterate, that uncertain future can be fixed, and I believe it can be fixed. Other countries have been fixed and moved forward from developing nations or underdeveloped nations to making progress in the world and providing things in a global society. The poverty needs to be stabilized, and it needs to be stabilized at every level. If you look at the household level in Afghanistan and poverty, there's widespread unemployment, there's inferior and insufficient housing, as well as challenging health care issues. Again, all of these things can be fixed. The region does face a noted crisis when it comes to providing a functional healthcare system. Looking at my time here. Okay, so the last thing I'll address here, because again, I want to make sure that the panel gets its say, you have to look at the infrastructure, and the infrastructure really plays a critical and positive role in the economic development. It affects the levels of income, and it affects the levels of employment. It raises the productivity that others would want to face and make the country better. Afghanistan doesn't have a well-documented engineering design, but my colleagues will tell you that they're working on that as well. Infrastructure is not limited to just the hard infrastructure, but we have to look at transportation services. We have to encompass things like water, sewage, electrical grids, telecommunications, and everything that's going to be impacted at a physical environment. Lastly, and I'll just conclude with this, there is no one-size-fits-all. It doesn't work that way. The one thing that is consistent in making things better is when you face 21st century problems, that you solve them with 21st century solutions and not 20th century solutions. We are a global society, and we're here to help each other. We're here to glean the success of what we do and the people that we help. So I'll move on, sir. Thank you very much for your time.
I'll go ahead and get started. I'm Jim Bullion. I am here representing myself as well as the Afghan American Chamber of Commerce, whose board I'm on. The chamber has been around for 10 years and really acts to try to promote the interaction between American and Afghan businesses and to link them together and to help the private sector in Afghanistan, which is going to be a theme of what I'm going to talk about here as well. Until 2014, I was the director of the Pentagon's Task Force for Business and Stability Operations. This was an organization that was set up actually starting back in Iraq in 2006 to help find ways to jumpstart the private sector in Iraq and Afghanistan. And we were focused exclusively on Afghanistan, but the mandate was to try to find ways to get the private sector moving, involved, and leading the expansion of the economy. And we focused, as you can imagine, heavily on the mining and oil and gas industries, but also did a lot of work in helping to improve the growth and profitability of the carpet industry, the cashmere industry, the small and medium-sized business development, helping small businesses grow and expand and get started, and really trying to identify those parts of the private sector that would have the biggest impact on Afghanistan's economy in the long run. And I'm here to tell you that the only answer ultimately is mining and oil and gas. And I'll go into that a little bit more in the future. But here we are after 14 years of recent conflict, and, following all of the invasion, the instability that's gone on over the last decades, really. And we've got Afghanistan stuck in a situation where it's dependent for $5 billion of its $7 billion budget on the international community. Despite having spent over $1 billion in foreign aid over the last 12 years, the poverty rate in Afghanistan is stuck at 36%, one of the highest in the world. And per capita gross national income is well under $1,000. Again, one of the lowest in the world. GNP growth has dropped off. It's now in the 2% range after having been high for the last several years. And imports are exceeding exports by 2 to 1, which is causing the Afghani to drop. It's recently dropped from 50 to the dollar to about 60 to the dollar, which is further weakening the economy. Unemployment is at 35 to 50%. And so young people who are educated, have been abroad maybe, and want opportunities are frustrated, and a lot of them are leaving. And unless something changes, and changes quickly and pretty dramatically, Afghanistan is going to be dependent on world charity forever. So how can this happen in a country that has some of the world's greatest resources in terms of mineral and possibly oil and gas wealth, and one of the youngest and most entrepreneurial populations, or potentially entrepreneurial populations? And I'll argue that what's missing in Afghanistan is a vibrant private sector that can unleash the amazing power of free markets to reduce poverty, to build personal self-esteem, and to create harmony and peace. Those are big issues, but I will argue that the free market is the only thing that can do that. Our efforts to rebuild Afghanistan with massive inflows of aid money paid to hundreds of thousands of foreign contractors have, in my argument, retarded the development of the Afghan private sector, and in fact made it almost impossible for Afghanistan to become an economically independent and self-sustaining country. In my mind, the economy drives good government, not the other way around. And all of our efforts have been focused on building the Afghan government, building the Afghan government, building the Afghan government, ignoring the private sector, which has really got to be the driver of that country. So coming out of decades of conflict and the insurgency which is fueled by opium and geopolitics, and to some extent by aid dollars, the Afghan private sector is extremely small. It's dominated by agriculture, hand-knotted carpets, and services related to the aid and conflict dollars. Now, Afghans can and have built businesses that can provide products that can replace imports and increase exports, And they've built thriving and successful businesses in telecommunications, construction, transportation, and others. Interesting question for you to think about. Afghanistan's got 4 very successful, very competitive telecommunications, wireless companies. Afghan's one of the most phone-intensive countries in the world. Almost everybody, man, woman, and child, and a lot of goats probably have cell phones. Very successful industry. And yet, they can't provide electricity to their people. Why is that? Private sector versus public sector. That's my argument on that. In addition to the wireless companies, airlines have been built that service thousands of travelers back and forth to Dubai and other places every day. There are fruit and juice packagers and marketers that are selling their products around the world. So Afghanistan has the capability to do this if this private sector can be unleashed. From 2006 to 2013, Afghanistan's GDP grew from $6 to $20 billion, but the vast majority of that growth was related to the war economy and funded by aid dollars. That's why it's dropping off so much now. As the military presence is declining, and so too is economic growth. And the private sector is simply not robust enough to pick up the slack. And all of the areas I mentioned, agriculture, carpets, and so on, simply are not big enough and not strong enough to carry the economy forward. Now let's look at other examples of countries that have been able to overcome some of these barriers and in fact have changed dramatically and have some similar characteristics to Afghanistan. One I looked at in particular was Mongolia. Now Mongolia, a few years ago, had a similar GNP to Afghanistan, about $5 billion. An economy made up of herding, of agriculture, very low GNI per capita. It was about $1,000 as of 10 or 15 years ago, even though Mongolia's got a very small population compared to Afghanistan. But their GNI per capita has now grown from $1,000 to $5,000. Their GNP has grown to $25 billion, and it's still growing very, very rapidly. The difference is that growth has been driven by billions of dollars of private investment into Mongolia. Not aid dollars, but private investment. In fact, the scale of the private investment into Mongolia is similar to the scale of the public dollars going into Afghanistan. And that foreign direct investment has really transformed the country by creating industries that have trained and hired skilled workforces and spawned thousands of companies to support the mining industry. This has all been driven by mining. Mongolia has similar mining resources to Afghanistan, and the country has realized that and has opened itself up to invite in mining companies and spend billions of dollars to transform that country. In the process, they have built infrastructure to support those mining companies, railroads, roads, other power generation, and so on. So Mongolia has moved from being a country of nomadic herders and a few state-owned enterprises to a country of entrepreneurs and owners with a stock exchange that actually has more than 200 companies listed on it and is very vibrant and active. There are a number of equity companies, private equity investment companies, investing specifically in Mongolia because of the potential returns there. And Mongolia's poverty rate has dropped from 40% to 20% or lower at this point. And government resources have soared, allowing it to provide better services to its people and to build a sovereign wealth fund, which now has about $50 billion in it to invest in the future when those mining revenues might decline. Now, Mongolia hasn't had the security problems and the disruption that Afghanistan has, so it's difficult to compare exactly, and that's, again, the #1 issue in Afghanistan. But it does show what can be done if the money can come in. And interestingly enough, the investment in Mongolia started in about 2010, 5 years ago. This isn't decades long. This is 5 years. In 5 years, Mongolia has been totally transformed. You look at a picture of Ulaanbaatar, it looks like Los Angeles. Skyscrapers, modern streets, fountains, parks, it's beautiful. And this could happen in Afghanistan as well, if they can get the security issue under control, and if they embrace the private sector.
James, I hate to interrupt.
You're going to cut me off already? Okay, well, I could go on, but that's my main theme, is that we've been focusing so much on public dollars going into Afghanistan. They have squeezed out the private sector. The private sector is the only engine for sustainable growth in a country like Afghanistan. The government needs to focus on providing security and reducing corruption, and the international aid agencies need to focus on reducing the risks to companies so they will come in and invest there. Things like loan guarantees, political risk insurance, better information for companies to understand what's available and how they can do business there. And those kind of efforts can then help bring the investment in and transform the country. And Ashraf Ghani needs to become the #1 salesperson for Afghanistan around the world. He should be out to every capital in the world beating the drum for the potential of Afghanistan to be transformed and a tremendous destination for investment dollars.
Thank you. If the slides are ready, we go back to Mr. Durani.
They're okay. Slides are there. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum. Good morning. I'm happy that you spoke before me because I thought I was the only contrarian here. But okay, so now I feel much better to see what I have to say. When a disaster is man-made in the form of war and conflict, we cannot build sustainable societies until the conflict is over and peace is restored. So the question in relation to Afghanistan that arises is that how come after decades of conflict we still don't have peace there? It's as elusive now as it was 14 years ago. Why did we reach a military stalemate? And what did the government Millennium Development Goals, their strategic development plans, and their priorities all parked? They're not moving anywhere. So these were some of the questions that I wanted to answer when I did my research on this paper, an outside-the-box look at Afghanistan, new ideas for peace and stability. And what I found out was surprising. What I found out were that there were several fundamental issues that were either missed, misunderstood, confused, or ignored when they initially started crafting the nation-building plan in 2001 and 2002. There are many of them, but I want to share only 3 here for you. And those 3, the first one is a confusion that exists as to what is the cause of conflict in Afghanistan and what is the effect. Almost all decision makers consider that the root causes of conflict in Afghanistan are political and military in nature. Well, my research found out that actually there are deep socioeconomic problems that in my paper I refer to them as anger is the #1 item. We see them on TV screens every week that things like this happen in that part of the world. And the second item is hunger. And also we see on TV screens how poor the people there are, and these two are actually fueling each other. There is also another form of hunger, and that comes in the form of greed. Some people with clout in Afghanistan, whatever they could get hold of, they just hoarded them for themselves. And these issues cannot be resolved by political and military means. The second item that I want to mention is the confusion and the lack of transparency and clarity regarding the issue of peace and victory. So I want to go back to the fundamentals here. When you want peace, you have to make investment in peace. And when you want to make To have victory, you make investment in victory. And these two have different dynamics and mechanics to be in place. So far, most of the investment in Afghanistan, whether Afghan investment or outside investment, has been not in peace. It has been in victory. The third thing that there is a lot of confusion about is also the issue of justice and revenge. While most of the documents that have been crafted refer to the requirement for transitional justice, all actions on the ground are really operations of revenge. And when you make investment in revenge and you make investment in victory, and you don't consider any kind of investment in getting rid of poverty and anger in the society, you don't get peace. And that's why you don't have sustainable opportunities for building sustainable communities. Despite all of that, all of these things, if we ignore, there have been substantial amount of money allocated for reconstruction outside the military. But they have been used very inefficiently. Some of the money, first of all, that was donated to Afghanistan never left the donor countries. And that money that left, a big chunk of that was spent in the form of markups and commissions in multi-level subcontracts. Then projects that were selected were not aligned with government goals and their priorities. And those projects were not selected based on producing prerequisites for peace and sustainable growth. As a result, what happened was that a lot of money was accumulated in the hands of a few people, which in turn resulted in a huge economic disparity in the society. And that economic disparity can be reflected by this picture here. This disparity is even more, much bigger than the original disparity that 40 years ago actually exploded the current situation there. In 2009, when the Obama administration was taking over, I made a proposal, an alternative proposal in my paper that was based on a strong top-down political will and a bottom-up application. And this thing was, every investment in Afghanistan was supposed to be predicated on social justice and forgiveness that will lead to reconciliation and peace so that the country can have breathing space and they can develop. Unfortunately, I didn't find any party with a political will who will push this agenda. All the same, what happens is that lately there, with the change of guard in Afghanistan and the signing of the BSA, there is a glimmer of hope that some kind of a ceasefire might actually prevail in the near future in Afghanistan, and there might be a few years of calm. And we have to be prepared for that. When that comes, we need to be prepared. And I recommend that any kind of new investment in Afghanistan that happens, it has to be aligned with the government Millennium Development Goals, with their development strategy, and with their priorities of capacity building. They should be in infrastructure and in job creation, which all will help to create the conditions for lasting peace and sustainable growth. So, in the light of this coming change, I asked my own group of 5 people that we are in our company, how can we contribute to be ready? And we actually interviewed many people in Afghanistan who work with the government and outside the government, and they told us a zillion things that are required. But among them, they said that there is a great need for soft skill training and development that is in line with building capacity in Afghanistan. And the Duranet Enterprises, we are very good in that thing. So I came up with 3 programs that I want to just float here. And they are all based on the content of this book that I wrote last year, which is written as a manual for high performance and a roadmap for leadership and personal effectiveness. And we have tested the seminars and workshops that led to this book for the past 7 years in Toronto.
Mr. Khan, the talk is getting very hot and good.
Okay,
Please
so-
conclude, yes.
Yes, okay, I'm concluding. So there are 3 items. One of them is to train through this program 300 civil servants as a pilot project. The second one is to create a 1-hour, 1-week TV program that will run for a whole year. That will be also based on these leadership, communication skills, and personal development. And the third one is to translate this book into Afghan official languages and make it affordably available to government employees, university students, and to all the youth in the community. And I'm open for suggestions and ideas. And thank you very much for it.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to talk a little bit, hopefully under 10 minutes, on some of the lessons that can be drawn from the support that's been given to private sector development and economic growth in Afghanistan. It's based somewhat on some research that I'm doing along with my colleague Zabiullah Zamani, looking at competing ideologies of the Afghan economy. In short, in 2001, Afghanistan did, at least on paper, adopt the market economy, and it's kind of a struggle that's been fought out ever since that on various levels. The narrative has certainly changed in Afghanistan since 2001. We've seen examples of how quickly that can change. And frankly, there wasn't a lot of discussion about sustainability in 2001. I'm not going to, I think Afghanistan's post-2001 economic performance has been well covered by a number of the previous speakers. I would only add that part of the, when we talk about the contraction of the last couple of years down to an average of 2% growth, some of it is from the reduction in international spending and the military presence, but I think a lot of it has to do with the pervasive uncertainty and insecurity that's gripping the country. When you talk to people, it's kind of palpable that people are reluctant to make those investments until there's some kind of a little bit more certainty. I promise you I'm not going to go into definitions of what we mean by sustainability. There's a lot of semantics, but I just do want to point out that a lot of the discussion in the media and also even in public policy focuses on financial sustainability. And I'd just like to emphasize that a lot of issues in sustainability are about technical, institutional, political, and organizational sustainability. So when we're talking about sustainability, we're really talking about the whole package, not just the ability of the government to pay its wage bill and fund schools. It's a slight exaggeration to say that we didn't think seriously about sustainability until the 2014 transition was announced in 2010. Even if it's not literally true that that's the case. And there were people who were thinking about it back in the early days, you know, how can we sustain these institutions? At the same time, there's also a whole set of institutional incentives and forces that really make it difficult for our institutions to think about sustainability. And maybe we can get into some of that in the discussion. I think a couple of the CGAR people talked about, well, it's one thing to draw lessons, but then what can we do about it? Can we act on it? And I think in a lot of cases, we really know what sustainability is about, or at least we know what we're doing is not sustainable, but it's just institutionally, it's very difficult to act on it and to do something about it. So I want to talk about a few of the factors that contributed to this challenge on, or inhibited sustainability. This is focusing largely on private sector development, but I think many of these issues and conclusions are relevant to other sectors as well. First and foremost, as Jim and some of the others point out, we called Afghanistan a post-conflict country, but in fact Afghanistan has been and is still under conflict. And I think often we forget that. And to state the obvious, it's kind of unrealistic to expect a sustainable economy or sustainable institutions to take root in the middle of that much uncertainty. First of all, it creates an unsustainable or an unhospitable a hostile climate for long-term investment, which is one reason you have a lot of emphasis on short-term trade and logistics. But also, perhaps more important, it really creates an inhospitable environment for creating the types of strong, transparent, and high-performing institutions, public institutions, that are needed to support private sector development and initiatives. People have short-term time horizons, which makes suppressing and discouraging corruption difficult. And we've seen a lot of cases where actually there's been regression, where progress was made, let's say in business licensing, whereas a couple of years later you go back and there's actually been a regression, and I think a lot of that has to do with the uncertainty. We don't know how long this is going to go on. We better, act while we can. I think also the war economy has set up a whole set of dynamics, incentives, which skew resources, not just to the short term, but also I think our focus on counterinsurgency and counterterrorism has ended up focusing resources in exactly those geographic insecure areas of the country where an enterprise is least likely to take root and where your returns on any kind of investment are going to be less. Which brings me to the question of conflicting objectives. Counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, stabilization, in many cases have short-term goals, which are sometimes in conflict with the longer-term economic or institutional development ones. Just a couple of examples. Early on, our desire to keep some of the important power holders, what we call warlords inside the tent, allowed them to kind of reestablish themselves, and in many cases they're the people who are responsible for suppressing competition, keeping individuals and firms from investing in local enterprises, and in many ways we've at least tacitly supported that. Political and security priorities skew the allocation, geographical allocation, and also there are many cases where there are trade-offs, for example, between speed and capacity. We want to get something done. Someone has to report back to Washington, so we're going to take all kinds of shortcuts that actually in the long term are not helpful. I think too much money, too fast, too soon. I mean, it sounds a little bit counterintuitive at the time in an environment where there are so many unmet needs. But I think now our thinking has evolved, and there's pretty much a consensus that the pressure to spend money, which was largely a political pressure, produced a number of unintended, if not unanticipated, consequences. Most significantly, I think we can look at corruption and the compromise of public institutions. As was pointed out earlier, when you undermine this, when you have corruption, you you undermine the legitimacy of the state. And so I think in many cases this was a function of the desire to spend too much money too quickly. We took all kinds of shortcuts. We didn't vet partners. We weren't quite as careful as we might have been about where the money was being spent. Additional consequences of that were, of course, creating a culture of dependence, a brain drain from the ministries as agencies bid up staff. Afghanistan now, I believe, has the highest labor costs in South Asia, which is one of the reasons it's uncompetitive in some areas.
If you could conclude, that would be good.
Okay. Another area was the lack of understanding of social, institutional, historical, and political context, and a lot of, after so many years of lack of involvement in Afghanistan between 1993 and 2001, we had very much of an information deficit. Institutions went in there and said, this is a blank slate, nothing exists, we need to build from the ground up, and I think there's ample evidence that this was not the case. One of the consequences of building on what we thought was a blank slate was that you created parallel institutions which were not well integrated into the other institutions. We didn't understand the existing bureaucracy, so we didn't understand some of how our policies and programs were actually being subverted and undermined rather than implemented. And as we know, some of these parallel structures which were created have actually just ceased to exist when the money was drawn down. And so now the ministry, in many cases, is left with projects that they can't implement. So I am out of time, but I just want to mention a couple of things. Successes, certainly telecommunications was one that was mentioned before. It was considered kind of an exception that proves the rule. Public financial management was considered certainly a relative success, in part because they relied on old budget processes that people actually in the ministries understood, rather than coming in with some very high-tech and modern things. And I would finally say, sort of as I started, that we can draw lessons learned about what we did right and what we did wrong, but I think we have to start by looking at our own institutions and the type of institutional incentives that are really baked in to go down some of these roads.
Thank you. Mr. Sawruk is going to speak about architecture, middle-class architecture in Herat. And I just want to make a brief comment about Herat. We have not met before. This is the first time we meet. And I'm so glad that he's going to present something about Herat. When I was a young student in the 1970s at Kabul University, I went to Herat and spent 2 months under a UNESCO project to preserve the historical monuments in Herat. And I have good memories of that historical city. Nonetheless, Afghanistan is a place of war and opium. But Herat, in the past history, they call it Herat created the Renaissance of the East. At times in 14th century, 18th century, Herat was a center of science, education, knowledge, poetry, and civilization. I don't want to talk too much because I know Mr. Sawruk is going to say it. Thank you so much for your paper.
Good afternoon, everyone. Again, I'm Ted Sawruk. I'm going to talk about mayhem and merriment, the middle-class architecture in Herat, Afghanistan. And basically what I'm looking at is that what people build reflects their values, or in this case, a shift in values. The article is a commentary that's divided into originally an introduction, historic context, 9 individual observations, and an epilogue, but due to the brevity of this presentation, I'm only going to present a short portion of that text, which includes a brief introduction, abbreviated context, and one of the observations. Afghanistan is a country rich in culture and history, but with an unfortunate recent past, one that's been mired in various wars over the past 3 decades. Afghanistan is in a process of catastrophic change, devastating to some, exhilarating to others. As the doors have opened to Western ideology, the previously isolated population is flooded with images, concepts, and opportunities. Unfortunately, some long-standing traditions, constructs, and archetypes are being, in part, or more often, wholesale abandoned, replaced by radical, even alien alternatives. These changes go far beyond gender roles, educational opportunities, and technical revolutions. The historic fabric of Afghan cities is being reconstructed, and a new architecture of display is revealing itself. When I first entered the city of Herat in 2009, it appeared to be a mid-sized, thriving urban center, filled with the vitality of so many of its Mid-East counterparts. However, within a few days, I was confronted with a stylistic collage of architectural manifestations, which revealed the fantastic world of Tim Burton or the retrofitted future of Ridley Scott. As an architect and historian, I reveled in the ancient city, marveled at its modern counterpart. Herat is perhaps the most beautiful of Afghan's ancient cities, was settled over 2,500 years ago, and was a major center for culture and learning in the 1300s. At the height of its glory, the city was the capital of the Timurid Empire and hosted one of the largest university complexes in the Islamic world. Today, the Citadel of Alexander, the 5 minarets, and the Friday Mosque are but a few remnants of that golden age of architecture. Beyond the walled city lay a construct of a more modern urbanity, one of tree-lined avenues and 20th century monuments. Pure geometric forms of white and gray support the classicism of British rule, the cubism of progressive monarchy, and the rationalism of Soviet invasion. Combined, they form a cohesive context of international-style neighborhoods, the hierarchy of successful 20th century building and urban planning. While the ancient city with its 800 or more residences is now protected from urban development by UNESCO, the rest of Herat is not. The walled courtyard house, a centuries-old tradition, is giving way to a freestanding multi-story concrete box. This recent middle-class construct is Afghan's version of the McMansion. These architectural interlopers have carved out a void in the cohesive urban fabric and present themselves with all the glamour of southern debutantes. However, lacking in refinement and elegance of gentle breeding, what burst on the scene is more akin to a burlesque stripper than a virtuous maiden. Exaggerated and ostentatious, the buildings scream to be noticed. Lacking modesty and decorum, what was once personal and private has suddenly been made public and crudely exposed. How and why has this happened? To me, at first, much of the new architecture appears thoughtless, ugly, even grotesque in a vulgar way. It took weeks of conscientious observation and quiet contemplation to begin to understand the nuances of the people and the new world they were building. The translation of historic prototypes into private temples for the nouveau riche is often considered reactionary and by some academics as a betrayal of larger cultural values. As an established architectural historian, did I initially reject these incarnations as the bastardization of canons which I held dear? Where was the restraint of Indigo Jones, the rigor of Frederick Schinkel, or the mastery of Victor Horta? Yet my education also taught me that the construct of pluralism allows for the simultaneous existence of both high and low culture. In the postmodern city, they can easily be mixed. With fewer than 10 architects in the city of Herat, recent building is left to the realm of engineers and contractors who market status, virility, and glamour, or as Charles Jenks proposes, desire. During the war years, Afghans migrated to neighboring Islamic countries in vast numbers. Upon their return, they brought with them a fondness for newfound architectural styles. Pre-existing plans imported from Iran, Pakistan, and India were revised and easily resold to these wealthy clients. The vitality of Afghan postmodernism is clearly a product of these influences, but still has its roots in American and European models. With an almost Victorian aesthetic, contemporary architecture is less about context, continuity, and complement, and more about the desire for abundance in all aspects of building, including texture, pattern, and materials. To Western eyes, it is a shock, but to local Afghans, these new houses are modern palaces. All aspects of country and culture are under attack from the outside world. Some choose to retreat into tradition and centuries-old religion. Others consume the new technology as fast as they can. The old architecture, the world of internationalism and rationalism, now seems too mundane, too bland, too harmonious. They are somehow brutal and oppressive. To the nouveau riche, this is the architecture of poverty, of inner-city neighborhoods in decline. The new architecture appears to be like an oasis in the desert. Color, movement, and ornament all bring these Persian palaces to life. Renovated and remodeled, the new grammar is a kind of Islamic Art Nouveau or Art Deco articulation, a combination of pastel colors, of free form and geometric fenestration. Dynamic, ostentatious, and sublime, the facades appeared to the general public on a multitude of levels. They begin to create a modernity in Herat that Baudelaire would find fascinating. Upon close inspection, one finds that it is all but a thin veil, inches of concrete applied to a traditional mud brick shell. The ornate facades are like clown makeup applied to Greek statues. Almost Gothic in nature, many facades start out as a pure expression of structure. The core is a traditional domino house, the modernist reinforced concrete prototype of concrete and slabs. Doors and windows are freely composed with the terracotta brick infill walls, and the entire shell is covered with a thin stucco facade. Until this point, the construction of these new houses resembles their traditional reserve counterparts. The next step, as Robert Venturi might say, is to decorate the shed. Reveling in the post-war prosperity of economic expansion, political freedom, and access to global technology, the newly empowered clients seem to be thrown into an aesthetic frenzy with the zeal of a Pentecostal congregation. The endless variety of classical details, sinuous ironwork, and garish colors are combined to embellish the facades. There is no one stylistic canon, so therefore all historic styles and motif are fair game as decoration. The compositions of creative lay artisans, these vernacular expressions lack the refinement and precision of their original academic inspirations. They wantonly disregard proportion and scale. Instead, they are individually eclectic and expressive. Repetitive, rescaled, and extruded, the multi-layers of fenestration wrap the projecting balconies and undulating roofs with the exorbitance. Often Romanesque in form, every function of the building is revealed and articulated on the exterior, defined by shape or form. The privacy characteristic of the walled city has been stripped bare. The family has been placed on exhibition. The viewers from the street are not only permitted, but also encouraged to read the building's spatial organization and physical hierarchy. In conclusion, the philosophy of Western deconstructivism is not an issue even considered in contemporary Afghanistan, for deconstruction exists in every aspect of daily life. It is neither exhilarating nor sublime. As such, the architecture of Herat has changed dramatically and the new buildings begin to emerge. The city is now overrun with a festival of built expressions and stylistic representations one could only describe as Islamic mannerism. The evolving city of Herat has become a true pluralist environment, and the mayhem and merriment of styles has generated a multitude of confusing yet significant representations and meanings. Yet all of these are new constructs or interlopers into the Muslim world. They bring change, but at what cost? Thank you.
Thank you. For the next several minutes, we will open up for any questions that anyone has, and we'll try to address them accordingly. So, any questions?
Thank you all very much. My question actually relates to the lessons learned that we were discussing. And you mentioned economic, financial, technological, business addressing sustainability aspects, but no one in that equation mentions environmental sustainability as a part of the solutions. Is there a reason for that? Was it purposely omitted, or is it just too big a topic to include?
Didn't mention.
Is that me? Okay. Yeah, obviously, Afghanistan is an environment. I mean, it's a semi-arid or arid environment. I mean, there's a whole host of environmental issues. I think, my guess, and obviously I can't speak for the government, but it's an issue that there's a certain set of individuals and groups who are trying to push on. There is is it a Minister of Environment or a Department of Environment that, pushes where it can, but frankly, it's just something that takes, a back seat. It seems to be crowded out by too many other priorities. I think Zabi was talking before about even within the Ministry of Agriculture, they have their annual plans and their strategic plans, but it doesn't seem to take on board some of the assessments about long-term climate evolution in Afghanistan that should be relevant. So I think there's just too many priorities, too many things going on. People get crowded out. And also on the development side, I would just add really quickly that some of the, particularly in the stabilization side, some of the work that's been done in drilling wells, for example, without proper water surveys has actually put areas and communities at risk. But I think it just gets crowded out.
It's clearly an issue with mining, and which would be one of the biggest impacts on the environment. And the Ministry of Mines has put in place regulations to try to control that and to make sure that any contracts they write do have environmental restrictions in them. But it's, you know, there are a lot of mining companies out there who have never been subject to any regulation or asked to do anything. So there's a lot of damage already been done by the small-scale artisanal mining operations, as well as larger coal mines and other things around the country. But for example, you know, one of the reasons that the big INEC copper mine has been delayed is that they discovered the remains of an ancient Buddhist city right on top of the deposit there. And so architects have been working there for the last 3-4 years to move everything that's there and to catalog it and identify it before any mining can take place. So there's a cognizance of it, but it's difficult.
I would also like to add that Afghanistan, as the Afghans claim, has a history of 5,000 years. And except it's a solid rock, everywhere else is an archaeological site. You just remove the topsoil, and then you have a city underneath. So there are major decisions that the Afghans have to make regarding development and preservation. Thank you.
So my question relates to the private sector. You had, over here.
Oh, thank you.
Get the light right in your eyes.
You
like
had
deers in
mentioned
headlights.
that there should be more private sector investment dollars spent versus the investment with the aid for the government. But don't you think that it would be the advantage of having a stable government with the infrastructure to support or to incentivize the private sector coming in? I mean, compared to Mongolia, you gave that example, but without having the security concerns, possibly the cultural differences, my perspective is that perhaps you'll need to have a stable government before you can have private sector investment. I just wanted to have your thoughts on that.
Yeah, my belief is that you won't have a stable government until you have a thriving private sector. Because a thriving private sector which leads to ownership by people and a stake in the country and a desire to preserve that stake and to grow it for the future is going to demand good governance. And we'll then look at what kind of structures do we have to have in place in terms of our Constitution, in terms of our laws, in terms of how our political leaders, our legislatures are accountable to the people in order to preserve our private sector. Without a private sector, nobody really cares whether the government's good or bad, because it doesn't do any good, it doesn't impact their lives, except to maybe give them handouts. And so I would argue that a private sector is critical in order to have a good government.
Let me just add to that. I mean, I think what you're talking about really is that kind of tension, growth versus stability, which comes first, which is a big topic of discussion in 2002. I would agree that you need to have a private sector in order to put demands on the government, but I would argue that there is a private sector in Afghanistan. I mean, it's hamstrung, it's subject to all kinds of corruption and predation by the state, but there is a private sector, and they are, in their own way, making demands on the government through whether it's complaining on the media or lobbying. I think there's a huge demand for good governance, supportive, enabling environment, institutions, which the government in the Constitution agreed to take on. It's just the institutional weaknesses. It's often called a failure of political will or a lack of political will or too many warlords inside the tent, whatever you want to call it. The institutions are still considered quite corrupt and not enablers. They're rather retarders of the private sector. So I think there's demand there. Whether or not it can happen is a question.
I mean, one of the problems in Afghanistan is that a lot of the private sector and the wealth is concentrated in a few hands. I mean, you could probably name 10 to 15 families that own and control a huge proportion of Afghanistan's wealth. So it's not a widespread participation in the economy in terms of ownership. The Mongolians did a brilliant thing years ago when they decided to privatize their state-owned industries. Obviously, they didn't have a lot of state-owned industry, but what they did was they said, we're going to give everybody in the country vouchers to own and buy shares in these state-owned industries, and they distributed them. So the people then had the ability to participate in the economy as it grew, and that turned into the Mongolian stock market, and hundreds of companies are listed there, and people participate in ownership of Mongolian companies in that way, which they don't have the right, or ability, they have the right, but not the ability to do so right now in Afghanistan.
I'd like to also add that I don't think it's necessarily a scaffolding process. It's more interrelated, interdependent. But you need something to drive that. And once you identify what that driving force is going to be, then I think we tend to piggyback on that. But you really need something, if you're going to build, you need a driving force in order to lay that foundation.
I would like to add that at this moment, Afghanistan is a divided society, and there is no consensus on what is the best national interest in Afghanistan. And unless peace is restored and people agree, have a consensus on peace and the form of organizations that they want in the society, I think talking of public sector and private sector and which one should have priority will be good discussion and to be prepared for the time when peace is restored, and then we can have a serious discussion on which one should have priority on it. That's from my research and my 2 cents worth of input.
Good morning. My name's Tanya Henderson. I'm over here. I just was wondering, thank you, panel, if you could speak a little bit about the development of the financial sector in terms of, cash economy versus more diversified financial services, particularly as it relates to investment in the private sector. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, clearly, a thriving private sector has to be fueled by access to capital, and without that, it's going to be hamstrung. And the Afghan banking sector has been very weak. It's been troubled with a lot of corruption. We know a lot about the Kabul bank example, where members of the government, essentially, or people close to members of the government, essentially looted the largest bank in Afghanistan and stole billions of dollars. And that has had a ripple effect throughout the banking sector. The banks in Afghanistan, there are a number of banks, both private and public banks, but they're not banks as we know them. They make very few loans. Their loan to asset ratio is very, very low. They don't know how to take risks. And again, there is so much risk in Afghanistan, looking to the uncertainties of the future, the conflicts, the security, and so on, that it's difficult for banks to make those kind of loans in this environment. And one idea that I've had is that a lot of our aid dollars should be flowing through those banks and allocated to the private sector through those banks, through guarantees to those banks, support to building a strong banking sector that can then fuel entrepreneurship and business in Afghanistan. That would be a much more effective use of a lot of our aid dollars than the way it's used now.